is viral. If it's viral, get global. It's the only PG approved antivirus. Not from the cattle, though. What's
Right, the next speaker is
Right.
Warwick Powell, Sister City Partners.
Yeah.
That's going to talk about a more concrete example in provenance and meat. So it ties into sustainability. It's a wonderful example after
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to struggle with the voice tonight, so just bear with me, and if you can't hear me up the back, just move closer. Thanks very much again for having me. I'm going to walk through with you a little bit of a story, I guess, which is about how I ended up being here, really. The first thing you need to know is that I'm not a technologist. I couldn't code half a line, let alone anything meaningful. But what I am is a banker, which means really that I'm interested in solving problems that involve intermediating between the real world and the financial world. And I wear two hats in that regard. The first hat is a role that I have as a partner in a small boutique investment bank in Hong Kong, which is where I'm from. And the other hat, which really gives rise to what I'm here to talk with you about today, is a not-for-profit regional investment bank, which I launched about 3.5 years ago in North Queensland. About 4.5 years or so ago, through our Hong Kong office, we were asked to have a look at the prospects and the merits of investing in a greenfield beef abattoir in Northern Australia. At the time, there was an emerging appreciation that demand for proteins, and particularly red meat, from China was going to grow, and there was strong interest from Chinese investors in both Hong Kong and in southern China to get a bit of the action. They'd already spent a bit of time at that time looking at dairy and particularly milk powder products, and started to look into the meats themselves. We'd already placed at that time some Chinese investors into some lamb production businesses in the Riverina, and they became more interested in the beef abattoir opportunity. So I spent about 6 months in 2012 traipsing around North Queensland, where I investigated, I guess, the business case for a greenfield abattoir that could slaughter about 250,000 head of cattle every year. Cut a long story short, there was no business case. We didn't build an abattoir. And a lot of the issues, I guess, that I came across at that time are the ones that we started thinking a lot more about, which has led me here today. Because whilst we couldn't develop a business case for a greenfield abattoir, what was undeniable was that despite the fact that Far North Queensland spent about $250 million a year on beef, plus probably about the same amount through its wholesale market, that there was still at the time this industry that was supposedly in crisis, and something didn't seem to make that much sense to me. How was it that you had $250 million a year of pretty much guaranteed revenue and you had an industry in crisis? So we began to keep an eye out, I guess, for an opportunity, because we saw a crisis as an opportunity to get involved in the food industry, and through doing that, start rebuilding aspects of a regional economy, but to do it in a very different way. Because one of the lessons that we learned through our due diligence process on the large-scale abattoir was that a very fragmented supply chain, which is what we have in Australia, replete with intermediaries, was actually the greatest source of sustainability risk in the whole supply chain, and as a result of that, a very significant source of sustainability risk for the communities that depended upon the industry. We were also interested at the time in what was going on in the China market space, and we'd done some spot trading, I guess, where we'd responded to client inquiries in China for a container here and a container there of box beef. And through those experiences, I guess, we started to touch on questions of provenance and questions of payment. So we, I guess, came across the challenges of LCs, letters of credit, which are still being used, and the difficulties in putting those together, being confident that in fact that they were real, that they weren't fakes, even when they came from the right branch, that they weren't actually being fraudulently produced by a bank officer who was in on the scam, right through to concerns around whether or not in fact what we were selling was meat, and hearing customers at the other end expressing concerns about what they were. So perhaps we could go to the first slide. So actually our first problem that we wanted to get our head around was food fraud. And I've just taken a few snippets of a few stories that you can find on the internet about food fraud problems in China. And it goes to a broader issue around food safety and security, I guess. But the picture that I particularly like is the third one in from the left-hand side in the top row, which is a cartoon. And it's got two guys looking at a big bowl of food. And on the left-hand side, you've got a guy, and the word on the left is the past. And his thought bubble is, I can't afford to eat what's in the bowl. And on the right-hand side is a guy dressed in a suit with a magnifying glass, looking through it, and it's got a question mark in the glass, and that represents the present. And he's thinking to himself, I'm not game to eat what's in the bowl. So we've had this transition from a place that 30 years ago where people couldn't afford to eat many things to a place where many people can afford to eat whatever they want to eat. It's just that they're not game to touch it because they don't know what it is. Next slide. At this end, though, we had a different set of problems. We had, in effect, a dysfunctional supply chain. In fact, I'd been involved in a whole range of industries over the last 20-odd years, and I thought I'd come across a fair bit of dysfunctionality. Well, that was just the warm-up act. The real dysfunctionality is in how Australia supplies meat. We've got an incredibly fragmented supply chain, as I said, where there are many intermediaries that, I guess you would say, earn their living by exploiting information asymmetries. And that little diagram on the left actually comes from a presentation that a friend of mine from ANZ did not so long ago. And I thought I'd rip it off because rather than give away my secrets on the beef supply chain, I'd just use his illustration on the wheat industry, which generally proves the point. And what you've got, even though it's a bit hard to see from a distance, the detail, but where there are little red lines, that's where there's a financial transaction. And wherever there's a red line, it also says the word delay. And wherever there's a delay, we have a very significant risk for the upstream supplier, who's waiting to get paid, of course. And we also have a significant impost on the supply chain as a whole and the nodes in that supply chain in relation to how you actually fund those delays in payment. What in fact happens is that a very significant amount of your capital risk, your debt risk, if you will, in that supply chain is concentrated amongst the players in the middle. In the beef supply chain case, it's the processor. The processor has to carry the risks of financing the acquisition of the beef and waiting a month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks before they get paid at the other end. And these are very, very significant numbers we're talking about. The large-scale abattoirs are slaughtering 200, 250,000 head a year. Each head of cattle is 450 kgs, and they're paying about, let's say, $3.50 to $4 a kg. That's just what they're paying at the farm gate. You can work out the numbers, but there's lots of zeros. So we're talking about a supply chain that involves a very significant amount of debt financing, essentially for cash flow by and large, and also, I guess, through products like factoring and that sort of thing. What we're trying to build is what my friend Leanne Kemp from Everledger has depicted for me on the left-hand side, which is a supply chain where we go from a live animal on the left-hand side through to a piece of steak on a plate. Not just paddock to plate, but hopefully paddock to palate. And we're trying to smooth out the supply chain in a number of ways. We're trying to address information asymmetry, obviously, so that we have, I guess, clarity throughout the supply chain on the data that we're dealing with. And we're banking on the fact that by getting clarity on information and overcoming information asymmetries, we're also going to start to address some of the financing problems that exist in the supply chain. Now, that was easier said than done. And in fact, the fragmented supply industry, where there are many vested interests in fragmentation and information asymmetry, saw very little reason at all in removing information asymmetry and creating integration. So we solved it in a pretty conventional investment banking kind of way. We went and bought our own. So we invested in a small abattoir and upstream supply facilities in terms of land and herds of cattle, and also downstream processing plants. And we did that over the last 2.5 years, perhaps in a totally foolhardy kind of way, but it was our way of proving a point. And so we've embarked on this little project, which we have eventually called Beef Ledger. But Beef Ledger is just one part of a broader initiative of ours, which is to rejuvenate regional economies by applying new technologies to integrate businesses, particularly smaller and medium-sized businesses that have been left out of the mainstream, so that they get the benefits of scale that come with virtual aggregation. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see what we're trying to figure out. What we've got is a very complex process. One of the things I liked about this beef activity, and I noticed on Bob's slides earlier that the food supply chain was actually the second last item on all that list of stuff, and there must have been about 80 things in that list. And the first column or two columns actually dealt with basically digital things, not analogue things, not things that you could touch and feel, but things that existed solely within the digital environment. We're dealing with something quite different here. We're dealing with a very analogue world. And so we have on the left-hand side a very analogue world of moving animals. And at the moment we tag them so that we know what animal that is and where they've been and who they belong to. In financial services, you guys have a thing called KYC. In the meat industry, they do too. It's know your cow. And this is the way we know our cow. And once we bring the cow in from the paddock, or we've moved it around, and I'll come to a bit of the complexity of what we have to try and figure out, they end up in a slaughterhouse, and they're slaughtered humanely, and then broken down through a complex process involving between 13 and 15 steps. And what's interesting about this is that we're not only seeing the movement of physical goods over space and time, which is intellectually, I think, a very interesting problem to deal with in a blockchain sense, because the blockchain is kind of spaceless and timeless in a kind of way. What we're dealing with is a process of disassembly. We're taking one big thing and we're converting it into lots of little things. Most provenance problems are actually about how you trace the component parts of a single thing, the different bits that come together to form a new whole. We're actually tracing the reverse, how an old whole became many different bits, and keeping it intact, digitally at least. As we progress through this process, of course, we go through a supply chain, the production chain, where a single animal is broken down into what could be 150 different parts. And those 150 different parts end up in packages, such as those in the third box. And those three are packages that have gone to China from Australia. Actually, I won't say that. Those three represent products that claim to have gone to China from Australia. I think the bottom one is probably more likely to have been the case. But the top two, you'd have to have your doubts. It's got a very nice label that stuck to the cling wrap that says in Chinese Australian beef. And I know that on the back of it is a label that's got a little bit of production data on it, and that's about it. But, you know, I mean, I've got an Epson printer at home too, and I could print out a production label as well. But anyway, we end up with a bunch of product, frozen or chilled, in packages, either as frozen quarters, they're pretty large hunks of meat, or in individually portion cut packages. Now you think about the challenge we've already had. We're trying to monitor all of this and keep a grip on it. I mean, we struggle to keep a track of the thing in real life. You know, the idea of you know, a whole rump being broken down into 13 or 14 pieces of meat in a factory as it gets moved along. And with scraps being shovelled into the scraps bin and later on made into sausages. You imagine keeping track of that and then being able to render it, if you will, into a digital format. And I'll come to some of the challenges that we're trying to overcome through some experimental work. I should say at this point, the reason why we ended up hooking up with Leanne at Everledger is that when I heard Leanne talk about what she was doing in diamonds, I couldn't help but think that every diamond is a unique rock, and so is every animal, and so is every piece of meat. So the parallels were pretty obvious to me. I also figured that diamonds were really quite easy, because frankly you just take a rough and you make it into something pretty, but it's always still the same thing. And as I said to you before, we take one thing and turn it into 150. So we thought Leanne needed a real challenge. And she was working pretty well in the space of provenance too, so we thought that there was something compatible there. But ultimately our end game is to get to the consumer market, domestically of course, but also in China, where, for those of you who've been, you'll notice in shops and supermarkets that the Chinese consumer shops through their mobile phone. They scan products all the time. We don't. Certainly, I don't see many Australian consumers scanning QR codes and other things, but Chinese consumers do. And but not only do they scan them because it gives them information or provides them with an opportunity to participate in a competition or something like that, they scan it because it's actually how they pay. So increasingly, they're using platforms like WeChat Pay to make payments. And if we are to succeed in exporting our product into markets like that, then ultimately we're going to need to ensure that we can deliver a payment system that is supportable and used by the consumers in those markets. And so we saw this whole set of problems as something that we were just going to fix with a blockchain. Well, how wrong I was. We weren't just going to fix it. I mean, it's actually an incredibly complex set of problems. And as you've heard tonight earlier, the idea that you have a technology quick fix to complex business problems is, I guess it's nirvana, but unfortunately the real world resists all the time. But anyway, that's the complexity of our world. Next slide, please. So anyway, we're trying to deal with two things, basically. We've got a pretty complex world, but I like to dumb it down. We're dealing with provenance. We need to be able to deliver consumer confidence that that piece of meat's real. But not only is that piece of meat beef, because that's what we're claiming it to be, but we also need to give them confidence about a few other things too. That piece of beef is actually from Australia. That's kind of handy. And the reason why that's kind of handy is because meat from Latin America is cheaper than Australian beef in China, which lo and behold creates a market for substitution, where Latin American meat is bought and relabelled as Australian meat, and undermines the value of Australian product. And we also need to be able to give consumers confidence that that piece of meat that claims to be an eye fillet is actually an eye fillet. In the meat industry, when they slice and dice off the bone and there's a bunch of scrap left over, that goes into a bucket. And as I said earlier, don't cringe up the back. You'll all be vegetarians by the end of this. It's made into sausages and patties. That's what we normally do. And if people have grown up in country Australia or even in suburban Australia in the olden times, the local butcher would turn all of that stuff into sausage and rissoles. What can happen these days is that you can take a whole bunch of that stuff, mix it with a little bit of protein powder, which is a protein glue, roll it up in a bit of Glad wrap, in a tube about the thickness of my arm, put it in the cold room overnight, and the next day I'll cut it up into nice 250 gram eye fillets. And it'll look just like an eye fillet. And if I'm really good at putting in this little bit of powder, I can make sure that where the different bits join together, it has little white lines, slightly off-white. And you'd think, gee, look at this, 6-star marbling. I'll pay more for that. So we need to deliver on 3 dimensions of provenance. The other thing, of course, in doing that is that we want to deal with asynchronous payments. Having taken over this whole supply chain and invested in it and put it together, we realised where the burden sat. The financial burden sat fair smack in the middle of the supply chain that had to carry the weight. And I have no doubt that if we can overcome the asymmetry of payments within the supply chain and tighten up the payment system, that we can reduce the whole of supply chain demand on capital or use of capital by at least 50%. Because most of the working capital, so to speak, isn't really at work most of the time. And if we can streamline payments so that we have almost instantaneous payments that are continual whenever a piece of meat is bought in a supermarket or paid for at a restaurant, feeding all the way through a supply chain, you'll need half as much of the juice to keep the chain going. So we've begun working on a platform which will give us 6 broad outcomes. Obviously, confidence in beef provenance, but we're also going to drive brand value and supply chain profitability. And the reason why we can drive brand value is that when something has provenance, hopefully it also has a good brand associations with attributes of desired quality, whatever they happen to be. We know in the Australian domestic beef industry that there has been a shift towards brands. Those of you who do eat beef, and if you still want to eat beef after tonight, go down to the supermarket or to your local butcher and have a look for brands like Cape Grim, 1824, Master Kobe. They're all brands. And then think about the organic branding in, say, Coles, Macro, and how the price of those brands differs, like by factors of 3 or 4, from the unbranded, undifferentiated, commoditised meat that's at the cheap end of the shopping shelves. So we can build brand value based on provenance. Now, we all know that happens as well in terms of wine, the classic case. And we all know that it's sort of happening with things like coffee, where coffee snobs can tell you the difference between the coffee that's really guano versus the coffee from Byron Bay or wherever and pay a different amount for it. The 4th thing we're trying to do is, of course, overcome meat fraud risk. 5thly, and I think this will be the interesting part in the long run, and this is something that doesn't exist at all at the moment, is to deliver direct feedback to producers. A producer, a farmer, a grazier, once they've grown an animal and sold it either to a feedlot or to an abattoir, actually loses connection with the end consumer. They never get any feedback. They don't know whether what they've produced is actually any good or not from the market's point of view. And in fact, that's how the disintermediated supply chain likes it. Because it keeps the producer just happily working behind the farm gate, just sucking it up, doing their lot in life. So much so, in fact, that they're often told by people in the industry and expert advisors that they need to get used to the fact that they're only going to have 2 good years out of every 10. Because that's how it is. It's when you have a good season, a couple of good years of climate, and in the meantime just borrow up, mortgage your property and just hope that it rains again sooner rather than later. Which brings us to the last point, and that is that we want to deliver transparency on what we call impact credentials. We embarked on this project not because I wanted to be in the meat game per se, or because I wanted to use these technologies to reinforce business as usual, but to undertake and implement an experiment in how these new technologies could deliver consumers and producers and the community at large a lot more transparency about the impacts of our decisions as consumers, whether they be ecological impacts, social impacts, or economic impacts. We're interested in how we can use these technologies to overcome the 2-speed economy that characterises Australia today. In the last 12 months, maybe 18 months, there have been at least 3 or 4 major reports out of the Parliament and other national policy organisations about the problems of regional Australia. The Productivity Commission, CEDA, there have been white papers, green papers on Northern Australia, those sorts of things. And at the end of the day, we want to make a contribution to addressing that problem. So impacts ultimately are important for what we're doing. Next. Provenance for us is pretty simple. We've got to get 4 wins, right? For consumers, for producers, for processors, and for regulators. It's kind of relatively easy for us because at least we've got the producers and the processors in the one tent, where we can get a bit of fairness between the two. Because historically, one of the most dysfunctional parts of the supply chain is that processors and producers think that it's their lot in life to fight with each other every week at the market. Processors usually win, but every now and then, 2 years out of every 10, the producer wins. But you know what, over 10 years, the average is pretty much what it is, and it seems to be that way consistently, actually, notwithstanding periodic fluctuations. So anyway, provenance for us is about delivering outcomes for consumers, processors, producers, and also for regulators, both domestically and internationally. Which brings us, I guess, to the guts of our architectural design. On the provenance side of things, we're really interested in 4 key attributes: the product itself, or the thing, the time period, because obviously an animal is born and then adds on weight and then gets moved from paddock to paddock before being sold off. So there's a time period involved. And then of course there's a time period involved when it's inside an abattoir. And then after it's slaughtered and processed, by the time it gets to the end market, there's time. We're interested in place. And place because partly provenance about place and quality is important for people. It's about impact on environment and on economies and on communities. But as many of my colleagues keep reminding me, place is also about the attributes of the ecosystem in which the animal itself is raised. Because people are interested in the grasses that the animal eats and how that impacts eating quality. Whether they were raised on native kangaroo grass, for example, or some imported grass species. Those things matter to certain consumers. And if we're building brand value, then increasingly we're going to want to be able to have a very clear line of sight or visibility on the places that an animal has been in its life. And last, but certainly not least, is people. People for us is about responsibility within the transactions in the supply chain. One of the great attributes of this kind of digital technology is its ability to automate processes and remove people from it. And there are tremendous economies to be gained from doing that. But there is no avoiding the reality that during some of the processes we're talking about, we actually want to impose people into them. We want to ensure that people take on responsibility for making sure that the right things get packed. It's about jobs, in part in regional Australia, but it's also about ensuring that people take responsibility and can't duck shove some of the challenges involved in making sure that we're tracking the movement of an analogue thing. And for us, people also matters because for some people, the question of provenance and people matters because they want to know that the people who've worked in this process, that has delivered us this mince patty or steak or osso buco or whatever it is, may have been from the first peoples of our country. Indigenous supply chains is not only a social impact, but because there is a demand for provenance in that. So understanding the people who are involved is also important. So we bundle those 4 things together and we punt them through, and forgive me, all of you technologists out there who know how complicated this really is, but we punt them through a bunch of smart contracts so that we can enable the payments. Now I say punt them through jokingly, of course, because I know how complicated this is, because underneath each of those 4 little icons, there's a depth of information and data that is riddled with risk and difficulty in collecting it. Yeah. The other part, of course, is that we're starting to move into the cross-border environment where we are exploring, only in the early stages now, an opportunity to reach the consumer at the other end who's using WeChat Pay and perhaps using a cryptocurrency. And we need to be prepared for it. We're not there yet, but that's certainly something in our design thought. Yeah. Okay, tools of the trade. On the right-hand side, actually, you'll see a little illustration of the process when a grazier sells an animal. And they are right now required to produce a bunch of documentation in triplicate. One for themselves, one for the shipper, and one for the receiver. And those documents is essentially know your cow, where it's been, the weigh bill, and those sorts of things. There is a semi-electronic version of this now. You can jump online and you can fill the form in online, and then you print it out and sign it in triplicate. So it takes the data from the tag that I showed you earlier, the number on the animal, and you track it all the way through. And in fact, every time an animal is relocated from one property to another, you're meant to complete paperwork so that you can track the movement of an animal and a group of animals from a property with an identification code to another property with an identification code. And in theory, we should be able to have a pretty good line of sight on where these animals have been. And in fact, the data's there, handwritten, often pretty scrappily, and certainly stored in a shoebox. But nonetheless, it's there. So we're dealing with this as a real world problem. Next slide. We're also dealing with payments. Now, in a transaction to buy and sell an animal, so a grazier buys animals from a breeder or sells animals to a feedlot or to an abattoir or to an agent. Each of those 4 different kinds of transactions involves at least half a dozen pieces of paper. And those half a dozen pieces of paper relate to information really covered off by at least 3 of those 4 Ps that I talked about before. The only one it really doesn't deal with is people. But certainly the product itself, the animal, its breed, its weight, its sex, etc., where it's been. So that's the product, the places where it's been, and of course the periods of time where it's been. What we started playing around with some colleagues who been using Ethereum basically to develop generic billing functions is how we can take some generic billing processes and customise them, if you will, to this sort of messy world. Part of our challenge really is not so much about taking all of those forms and making them amenable to this world of smart contracting, but it's designing interfaces that fat fingers can use, because it's fine for people who work in offices all their lives who are comfortable with using mobile phone devices and iPads and those sorts of things, but it's a different story when you're out of the feedlot or at the Charters Towers markets, where you've got to capture this information and process some billing. But anyway, we've gotten to a point where we've got some preliminary smart contracts drawn up, and we're experimenting with some parallel transactions with some participating graziers in southern central Queensland and some graziers in the north as well. Next slide. Just wanted to give you a sense again of more of the documentation. We've got the bill of lading and the Know Your Cow forms on the left. You've got Livestock Production Assurance Guidebook, which has a whole bunch of requirements around how you actually graze and raise the animals and manage your land, and there's certifications and training and all those sorts of things that go with it. The one on the right I think is pretty cool. You can't read it, and that's partly the sort of rhetorical point. What that is a list of chemicals that are regularly and generally administered to a beef cow by a vet. And when you export, there are regulations around the time that must elapse between when the chemical was administered and when you can actually slaughter and export that animal. So that's a pretty critical, important piece of information. So we're starting to, as we peel away the layers of product provenance data requirements, we're starting to come across these sorts of things. And needless to say, this opens up another Pandora's box. But anyway, we're getting there. Next slide. This little table, and it's my last table, is really just to remind me about how complex an undertaking we've embarked upon. Across the top is 15 columns, and they're the 15 activities inside an abattoir, from slaughtering the animal or stunning it, right through to the last column, which is shipping it, and everything in between. And on the left-hand side, the rows, there's about 33 or 34 lines, which cover, at a core, data labels, if you will, that go with the 4 provenance dimensions. And underneath each of those, of course, is another layer of data. Now, 33 times 15 is 450 or something, isn't it? A reasonably large number. It's a hell of a lot of data cells, underneath which have probably another 10 or 20 pieces of data that go with it. So this is the little undertaking we've embarked upon, which is to keep track of one animal becoming 150 things over 400 kilometres and 2.5 years of its life through a window of 450 cells and maybe 4,000 pieces of data, so that we can deliver a piece of beef in a wrapper in a Chinese supermarket where a consumer can scan a QR code and know that it meets their exacting requirements and can pay for it with a cryptocurrency there and then. Thank you very much.
I don't know if I should torture you by letting people ask you questions.
I'm okay, so long as people don't mind listening to me grin croaky. I had some drugs earlier, speaking of drugs, and I'm feeling fine.
Good enough to share with the class?
Well, they're just Codral, so they're not that good. Questions? Yes.
Is it very proactive in your business?
Yeah.
So it's quite difficult to understand second culture. But have you ever approached government to get grants or something like that, developing new technology or to improving existing business?
Yeah, good question. We obviously, most of this has been, well, all of this has been funded off our own balance sheet so far, but we are currently in the middle of a Ignite Ideas grant funding round for one very small bit of activity, and we're also founding members of the Food Agility CRC based out of the UTS, where as we progress this work and as they become established, we will be taking a lot of this work forward into that context as well. We've just begun recently an engagement with the Office of Chief Scientist in Queensland. So I guess we have tended to avoid a traditional pathway of government funding, but at the same time, having taken it so far now and having bedded it down with private investment, bearing in mind most of our private investment has come from supply chain participants. That's part of our underlying philosophy. We're not here to build a supply chain that I own. In fact, we're here to build a supply chain that the suppliers and the participants in the supply chain itself will own. That's my exit pathway, and so that's how we've gone. Yeah.
Because government just recently announced grants up to $1 million per person, but they ask you to work, like you said, small industry, with one maybe big industry, with one university, and with one, I don't remember, some other business. So if you have like four partners, they organize special departments now.
Yeah. I think that there's some matching money required there, and so we'll be embarking on another round of capital raising in the not too distant future around some of this. This work has been conducted within the context of our not-for-profit until recently. We've just given birth to the special purpose vehicle to carry it forward, and that special purpose vehicle will in due course morph into a public unlisted company. Look, I mean, we've actually worked with CSIRO and James Cook University as well, now that you've prodded my memory. mainly on the behind the farm gate stuff. Almost everything I talked to you about today was what we've done this side of the farm gate, if you will. But there's a bunch of issues behind the farm gate too, because we're interested in obviously the impact on the eco footprint of grazing cattle. I think it is widely recognised that cattle grazing is one of the most significant emissions creating activities that we have, and that if we are to make a contribution to emissions reduction, then getting a handle on how we produce meat on a lesser footprint impact is going to be important. We're also interested in doing that without compromising product quality and also product economics. So what we've focused on with James Cook Uni is working on a project that involves ways of measuring the performance of an animal over time in its place. In other words, how quickly they get fat. And unsurprisingly, they're just like people, you know, some are genetically predisposed to getting fat quicker, and the extent to which they get fat quickly depends also in part on how much they eat and how much they walk, and whether it's hot. If it's a bit hot, then obviously they don't put on as much weight as quickly. So we want to be able to capture data on that process during the life of an animal, so that we can not only deliver provenance information, but also understand yield performance as well, and whether or not that provenance information enables us to better predict performance and price at the other end over time as consumers start providing feedback on brand value.
But the technology that we use about analytics,
Yeah,
that's what we use it
yeah.
Do you see any other application in any other industries to use this?
I mean, we're playing around with a whole range of interesting Internet of Things tools, if you will, inside the abattoir. That's actually where most of our challenges, I think, actually are. The ledger itself isn't that complicated. It's actually how we get a digital grip on what's going on in the real world, and render that into the ledger. Other applications, sure. The obvious ones are in other protein chains. So lamb, pork production. I know that in pork production it's already being looked at in China itself, where pork's one of the top 2 proteins consumed, and where you have a lot of food safety and fraud issues around pork. So certainly in meats, but in a whole range of other areas in horticulture as well. And I'm hoping that, I guess, through what we're doing on this one, we'll be able to lend some insights for people in other food producing sectors to start with, in horticulture and those sorts of things, to hopefully not have to make some of the mistakes we've made. We've all gone down dead ends. They've been interesting experiments, but we're pretty quick at drawing them up. I don't have a problem saying that didn't work, move on. Yeah.
There's been applied to different livestock using the system that you've done for beef ledger.
You mean lamb and things like that?
Lamb,
Yeah.
goats, pigs.
No reason why you can't. They've all got tags. It'd probably be more difficult with chickens, but that's just a volume problem, I think, and a scale of device problem. Yeah.
So the Australian Livestock Exporters Association reviewed their whole technology stack as recently as 18 months ago, and I presented to them on blockchain. At that time, they had no clue what I was talking about.
Yep.
The timing wasn't quite right.
Yep.
But they were absolutely interested in this. They were looking much towards smart labelling, smart packaging.
Yep.
And I'll tell you now that everything you've got here, if you're not talking to Fonterra in New Zealand, you should be.
Yeah.
Because they're absolutely just beginning to embark on this for the dairy trade.
Yeah, dairy. We've been approached by
They're
dairy.
a $14 billion a year dairy company.
Yeah.
And they have huge problems with
Yeah.
baby formula and things like this in
Yeah.
China.
Yeah, absolutely. You're dead right. We've been approached by some dairy players domestically. I haven't had Fonterra knock on the door, and I haven't knocked on Fonterra's door. We've spent, I guess, a fair bit of time knuckled down in our own development process, but also spending time with our graziers and understanding the challenges in the field. Having taken over our own abattoir, it's actually enabled us to have our own R&D facility as well. That's been absolutely pivotal to this, because we're playing around with some tools that if you didn't have control over your own facility, it'd be pretty hard pressed having an opportunity to do that. So we've been lucky in that regard. But the formula issues, I think, this is the milk powder formula issues are no different. Similar challenges, taking one thing, transforming it into another. Yeah. And if you know people on Fenterra, I'll follow up with you. Yeah.
One hell of a concierge MVP.
Yeah. I also love fly fishing, so you know, any excuse to get to the South Island, I'll grab with 2 hands. Yeah. This one first,
I
and then
was
this
just
one.
wondering, with some of these ledgers starting to come out, like I heard about one a while ago with vets, for instance, and life and racehorses, so
Yeah.
thinking about drugs, how they're going to all start interacting with each other, because they're going to be on different technology stacks, potentially. You know, you're talking about feed, might be agricultural ledger for that becomes the feed for the cows. I'm just wondering, is anyone doing any work in how these things are all going to start working together? Or is it going to be another problem?
Oh, well, I guess we've had
Anyone here?
I guess we've had data interoperability
Yeah.
issues for a long time, and it creates an industry of its own. So, you know, I mean, it's an interesting problem. I guess when we're so focused on our own vertical, we tend not to be too worried about other things. But yeah, you're right. I mean, if we're needing to have data related to, say, the grains that are used in a feedlot and whether they're organic certified or whatever, then there are going to be some issues like that cropping up from time to time. Yeah.
I guess with a smart contract, you may be able to sort of exit from one ledger tech into another, and there's potentially some sort of in-between contract there. I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
Well, I guess I guess in the end you just need to get the hashes to line up, and you know, it really doesn't matter what it was in its previous life by the time it gets to a situation where we actually need to talk with each other. This one first.
Yeah, I was just, it's clearly a social conscious element of what you're doing here in supporting people. I used to grow cocoa in New Guinea, and we had an instrument called a cocoa stabilisation fund. Because of the wild fluctuations in the price of cocoa, depending on whether Africa grew huge lots or South America, the price could frequently fall below production costs. So the industry instituted a system when the prices were high, percentage was taken off for investment into other things, so that when the prices dropped below, then the funding was returned to the farmers or to the growers so that they could maintain their operation, because it's not something you pull on. It's like you've got a 12-year cycle with cocoa and 25 years with coconuts, and quite a similar thing. Do you think your cattle producers would benefit from an instrumentation of that sort?
Absolutely. One of the reasons why we started going down this path in integrating a supply chain is that the way the supply chain in its fragmented form exists today exposes particularly producers, but not only producers, to significant volatility in pricing. And what became very evident to me is that there is only so much for every kilo of meat in the marketplace from a financial point of view. You know, a kilo is worth X, and that X is what a consumer pays for it. And from that X, you need to deliver cost recovery across your supply chain and deliver a margin to the nodes and activities within that supply chain. If you think of the supply chain as a half bottle of water and you tilt it on its side, it's pretty even all the way through, right? But when you tilt it too far one way or the other, one end's empty, one end's full. And when one end's empty, that empty end still needs to be lubricated, if you will, and it's lubricated usually through debt finance, or they don't make it, and the farm's sold out, or the factory shuts, or the processing plant shuts down, or whatever it happens to be. And we've got a fair idea, by virtue of having visibility across the whole process now, as to what the pricing sweet spots are. So I know within the supply chain we're working in what the tolerances of bottle wobble are in terms of how much reserve we need to maintain a very good rate of return across the whole chain without any particular section of that chain super profiting, if you will. Now, obviously, the challenge you have is that producers will be looking for opportunities to gain that extra 5 cents a kilo. So if you've got a floor and a ceiling price structure, there is every possibility that the grazier will think, well, the spot price is 5 cents a kilo more than the ceiling, I'm going to take my cattle out. Now, clearly you deal with that through things like legal instruments, but also create opportunities for the management of spot markets within your system as well, so that you don't have to have every animal captured within that floor and ceiling regime. There's no reason why that can't be a part of it to create some stability with a longer future or a spot price as well. But all of that's entirely possible. I mean, I can see a future where, in fact, consumers will drive the price. We'll end up seeing a more Uberisation of particularly the more expensive cuts, where we will know that there are X number of consumers within a city looking for a certain amount of 6-star Wagyu, for example, from Australia, from a particular farm, and we know that there's only 5 packets of it left. You can auction it. Buy now, we'll deliver it. So there's lots of ways in which pricing can play out. But for me, the main thing is all of that's fine and that's very interesting, but stabilising that supply chain and stabilising that financial flow throughout the supply chain is critical, because there's absolutely no point in one part of the supply chain being exemplary if its other parts of the chain actually don't work, because at the end of the day, the chain's viability is actually what drives livelihoods through regional Australian economies, number one. And number two, once you've built a chain that is viable as a chain in its entirety, what that delivers to all the participants in that supply chain is a succession option. Right? One of the problems in regional Australia is that small and medium farmers and small and medium business people, when they get closer to retirement age, have nowhere to go. Who's going to buy their little operation? In our model, the supply chain will buy their operation as a buyer of last resort. Why? Because the supply chain needs them. The chains are linked. And there's a vested interest in the chain to pay fair price for it, because we actually want to capture all the value from that particular node of activity.
So is there an opportunity for your producers to conversely take a stake in your operation?
That's what we invite. So our underlying ownership structure in the supply chain itself and in the ledger, which are two things, one's a digital chain, if you will, and one's an analogue chain, is for supply chain participants to be ownership. That is the end outcome, and that's what we work towards. So, in effect, there's not much revolutionary about this, because the ideas that we apply in this context are actually very old. They're ideas of mutuality, right? Mutual ownership of the supply chain, where each link recognises the mutual value of each other to each other, delivers the stability that you need. Just like insurance does, multi-party ownership of the supply chain will as well, with transparency. Mutuals fail and supply chains fail when people don't trust each other, or where you don't have something that enables exchange to take place despite the lack of trust. The beauty, I guess, of the blockchain environment is that we can actually achieve the latter whilst building the former. I mean, this is an issue that has a lot of egos in it, and you would have to say that there is a deficit of trust in parts of the industry as well. And we're saying, by all means, continue to distrust each other, but trust the transparency of the system.
Could
Yes.
you speed up the whole process?
Yes.
What I'm saying is that it becomes a lot more efficient for both ends, and it becomes a lot more profitable when you can sort of critique it through each process
Yeah.
from start to finish.
Yeah, we tighten up the supply chain in terms of the number of actual participants in it. So that list that was put up earlier of all those intermediaries, whether they're agents or whatever they happen to be, those functions, those activities, were needed in a world where you had information asymmetry, right? When you no longer have a world of information asymmetry and you can have peer-to-peer interaction, then those functions that once had a purpose and a need are no longer needed. So they get replaced. There's no doubt about that. But in doing that, it means that the 5% commission that used to be paid is no longer paid, and it gets retained by the supply chain. Right? But the other point we say is that we don't create these systems with a view of taking away jobs. There's not much point if that's just the purpose. What we do is that we create these systems to create efficiencies and fairness and transparency, and we say to the people who are going to lose their jobs, come and join the ownership structure. Own the machine that's going to do the job you used to do, right? There seems to be a certain sense in that. You don't need to do this job forever if you own the machine that does it for you. The key is owning the machine. And so we've built an ownership structure that enables people to do that. So we're using the technology to transform the way in which ownership exists within these supply chains.
So,
Last one.
The last one.
how are you going with industry acceptance for this sort of approach?
We have some acceptance, and I suspect we have some people watching it closely.
You need to get the complete vertical integration of all the...
That's why we've actually done it ourselves
Yeah.
as a demonstration chain. So we have producers, processors, distributors, all the right through, inside our structure.
Do you see the Australian government coming in to support that this becomes something that the industry adopts to help prove up Australian branding for Australian beef overseas?
I'd like to think that the industry itself will figure out that it's probably not a bad idea to do it before the government needs to tell them that it's a good idea. Where government is going to become important in this is that we will need to develop government-to-government protocols around the acceptance of different kinds of technologies as validation technologies for provenance. So if we are to certify that this shipment of product came from an export-accredited abattoir, and we're doing it through this particular method as opposed to the current method, which is someone filling in a form and writing for the factory number, we need to know that the counterparty at the other end, such as a Chinese regulator, will accept this model of data collection as a valid model of data collection. And that will require at some point some level of, I think, government-to-government protocol. Now, the Chinese are very committed to food provenance, and it's because their consuming public is increasingly sensitive to food fraud and food safety risks. So we're very confident, and we've had some discussions, very early discussions with people involved on the Chinese regulatory side, that they will be very, very open to this technology platform as a parallel, not as a replacement to an existing system, but as a parallel but acceptable system of credentialing. Whether the government sees light, well, who knows? But I certainly don't think you need government for the vast majority of what we're doing in terms of regulatory changes and those sorts of things.
Well, I see it's being accepted by China quite well, since most Australian cattle farms are now being sold to the Chinese. It's in their best interest to get the best value for their dollar.
Well, some are being sold, but it's certainly not most. The most significant owners of Australian cattle stations that aren't Australians are actually the English, the Canadians and the Americans. But yeah, you're right. I mean, the buyers themselves of the end product and those who are investing in it with a view to supplying their own markets will want to have ways in which they can have greater confidence about provenance, that the claims they're making about the product being what it is are substantiable and validated. So that's why we're having we do receive a good reception from people from the China side of the equation, if you will, and they're increasingly open-minded to the role of distributed ledgers in provenance and validation systems generally. Last October, a Chinese white paper was issued, which, in a sense, pulled together a view in China that took really 18 months to come together, because 18 months before then there was a general hesitancy, probably like many other parts of the world. But come October last year, there was a very clear view that there was a lot of legs in this as a tool for both financial services right through to food and that whole list of things as well.
Makes me think of like the farmer, hundreds of years ago, the farmer would have had maybe one cow,
Yeah.
with a rope around it and take it to the butcher and then take it to the market
Yep.
and be involved in the whole process.
And what we're doing is replacing the farmer with a digital blockchain, as if the farmer was still there. I mean, imagine when a consumer scans a product and they know that it's from a certain farm, or that there's a program there that says, for every 10% will go to a local healthcare provider or whatever it happens to be, and a video gets played of of a child or a person in that community that says to the consumer, look, thanks for buying, because what you've just bought has contributed to, a new hospital, a new healthcare centre, a new school, or whatever it happens to be. I mean, that kind of connectivity that we can create between consumers in a totally different part of the world and the producing communities is the kind of window that we want to create through this, so that we get a much tighter level of, empathy and understanding around the connection between what we spend and what happens at the other end.
And we want that in all products.
Yeah, look, and I think that there is every possibility over the foreseeable future, however long that is, that more and more products will go down this pathway, and as the ability for consumers to drive consumer behavioural change, the more likely it is that complex supply chains will see value in investing in making the change. One of our biggest challenges is what we do inside an abattoir, actually. And that's actually the most complex part of all of this, where one becomes 150. All right, that's actually where the really hard work, conceptual work goes, and hardware technology work goes. There's a bit of secret sauce in that. But that's they're our challenges. And once we develop some ways of dealing with those challenges, as I think we're getting closer to doing, it will become more applicable in many other production lines, which arguably are easier to do.
Cool.
Cool.
I think we should finish it there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
I think we've had enough discussion at the end of each of the presentations, so thanks everyone for coming along, and we'll be posting out to the mailing list to let you know what's happening with the next meetup or hackathon or whatever comes next.
I should say one last thing. We are a very open community in terms of Beef Ledger and Sister City partners, in terms of creating pathways for people who think that they want to be involved or learn things and share things. So my contact details are there. Feel free to drop me a line. If you can code, all the better. But if you've got ideas around how some of the things I might have talked about tonight can be applied in other areas, let's catch up. Let's get together and see what we can do.
Where are you based? Where are you based?
Anywhere between Brisbane, Shanghai and Hong Kong.